Hello, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Haruka Radbush. I'm the Senior Programs Manager here at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, and we're based here in San Francisco's Japantown neighborhood. And we're very excited to bring to you tonight a very special book talk with author Bradford Pearson, who wrote the book The Eagles of Heart Mountain, and he will be showing off his book and explaining a little bit about his process in writing it and the things that he learned along the way, as well as the connections that he made with folks in the Japanese American community in the course of writing this book. So, with that, I'd like to welcome Bradford. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Philadelphia tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Haruka. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so just to open up, could you tell us about the book in general? Just give us an overview, and also knowing that the book is about football and in particular the high school football team of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming World War II incarceration camp. Could you tell us a little bit more about who the Eagles of Heart Mountain were as well?
Sure. So the book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, is the easiest way that I always try to pitch it is that it's a story of the best high school football team in the history of the state of Wyoming, who just happened to be a group of incarcerated Japanese American teenagers during World War II. So whenever I sort of explain it that way, you can see people's minds kind of like putting all of those pieces together and what that actually means. So basically, I follow the players here who are on the Heart Mountain Eagles football team. Guys like Babe Nomura from Hollywood, George Yoshinaga, who grew up in Mountain View, Kichi Ikeda, who grew up in Hollywood as well. And I followed their lives from before the war, through the camps, and then afterwards. And what I try to do is use the team, the Heart Mountain Eagles, to sort of tell the story of Japanese American life in the United States. So the time before the war, incarceration, and afterwards. I sort of saw this book as an opportunity to, if I could sort of hook people in on this football angle. So people from maybe outside the Japanese American community who aren't as familiar with the topic of incarceration and what this time period in American history meant. If I can hook those people in with the sort of the angle of football, I could really teach and sort of share a lot more of this history that I think is important. And I think that most Americans should know. So that was why I kind of wrote the book the way I did, which, it sort of weaves the story of the Eagles in with camp life, the war around them, and then using some of the characters' parents, even sort of telling the story of how the Japanese came to America and the success they had that eventually led to incarceration. And then sort of wrapped in that story in the camp is also the story of the Heart Mountain draft resistance,
Mhm.
which when I started doing research on the football team, I realized was so intertwined with the story of not only Heart Mountain, but then of all the camps through 1944 and 1945, that I thought that I had to include it. And it served as a sort of interesting way to look at what all of these young men were going through at that point in camp.
Absolutely. And I know that there's certainly many football fans from within the Japanese American community
Mhm.
too who were absolutely thrilled and excited to be able to read a book that kind of covers not only something that speaks to their own personal histories and their family's experiences, but also, one of their favorite passions as well, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, this is fantastic. So I think one of the immediate things that came to mind when I learned about the book was just wondering how you yourself came across the story of the Heart Mountain football team and what inspired you to write an entire book about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still kind of hard. I feel like I was in like a dream when I wrote it. I think the first draft was like 115,000 words, and I eventually cut it down to 90,000, but there's times where I still can't believe that I actually typed that many letters. But but basically I sort of came to this story in an odd roundabout way, in that I was in Wyoming on a completely different magazine assignment working on a story about Yellowstone. So I was in Northwest Wyoming for a week working on a story about Yellowstone and sort of Northwest Wyoming, Cody area, and the things around there, sort of a fun travel story. And one of the folks that I was with on this trip suggested that we go to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center one day and sort of learn about the history of Heart Mountain. And I said, sure, that sounds interesting. I studied history in college, and I think of myself as a pretty well-versed person in American history and world history. So I walked in thinking, oh, I understand what happened here, and sort of walked in solemnly. And I walked out really pretty flat embarrassed by how little I really knew about Japanese American incarceration. And while I was in the museum, there was one display about high school life in the camp. And there were two sentences that were some of the last sentences on the entire display. I still think it was one of the only times I've ever fully read a museum display from start all the way to the finish. Sorry for any museum curators out there. But and it had two sentences about the high school football team and about their successes. And I sort of thought about it, and it sort of sat in my brain. I went, huh, that's interesting. Like, these kids that were incarcerated in this camp, they got sent to this camp. How were they so successful at football?
Hmm.
And so then I go home and I write the story about Yellowstone, and I went back to my regular day job. And then, but I just couldn't stop thinking about those two sentences about this football team. And I couldn't get them out of my brain. And any good reporter knows that if you're working on a story, but you can't stop thinking about a different story, that story is the one you should actually be focusing your time on. So I reached out to the Heart Mountain Foundation staff and said, hey, I don't know if this is going to be anything. I don't know, anything about this, but here's what I'm kind of interested in learning about. There's this high school football team. And they were like, oh yeah, we're familiar with their success, but we don't know that much beyond, what we even have in our own display. But they hooked me up with someone that some of you may know, a guy named Bacon Sakatani, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain and then has sort of gone on to help create the foundation and sort of leads the pilgrimages. And they said he has every copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper on CD. So I reach out to Bacon. He sends me he responds, I think, the same day and says, sure, I don't know who you are, but I'll send you this. He says, so he sends me a CD that has a PDF of every single copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel and then the Heart Mountain High School newspaper.
Wow, what luck.
Yeah. So then at night, I come home from work, I sit down and I start reading every copy of the Sentinel. And the Sentinel was really special in a lot of ways in the camp, in that it was by far the most professional newspaper at any of the camps, because you had a lot of people from the newspaper industry that ended up at Heart Mountain. So they created a really professional newspaper, which, lucky for me, had a very good sports section. So every week that there's a football game, they would have box scores from the previous weeks, previews of the upcoming games, gamers, columns, everything that somebody could ask for if they really wanted to learn more about a football team. So I started reading through those and basically sort of created a spreadsheet with a roster of the top players that I wanted, that kept popping up in all of these stories, and people that I knew that if I, at this point, I didn't even know what this might be. It could be nothing. It could be a magazine story. It could be a short project that goes nowhere. It could be a book. I really didn't know. So that was once I created this spreadsheet, that I put the sort of the players that kept coming up the most, I added and put them at the top and said, these are the people that I couldn't do the book without. I could not do this project without reaching out to Babe Nomura's family, George Oshinaga's family, Kichi Ikeda, and then some other folks that sort of came up in my research that I realized became sort of integral parts of this. And the very first person I reached out to was Babe Nomura's daughter, Jan Mori, who, I reached out to her blindly and sort of said the same thing I said to Bacon. I don't know what this is. I don't know if this is going to be anything, but would you be willing to talk to me about your dad? And we got on the phone and talked. And then pretty soon after that, I guess I passed. And then I started reaching out, and then I started attending the Heart Mountain pilgrimages. And then I just started building sources and sources. And that eventually led to a book proposal that was acquired. And then I actually had to do the work to write the rest of the book. So that's a much longer answer than I probably should have given, but
No, that's fantastic. And I guess what was the time frame that from, I guess, the initial like visit to Heart Mountain to the
Yeah.
conception of an actual book.
Yeah. So I was at Heart Mountain in 2013 or 2014.
Mhm.
I always forget. And then basically, I didn't really start working on the book in earnest and start reaching out to people until 2016.
Mhm.
Um, and then that sort of time frame, Donald Trump had just been elected, and I was trying to find ways with my own skill set to kind of push back against some of the policies that I felt like his administration was pushing forward. And I thought that this story and the story of this football team and the story of Japanese American incarceration was really unfortunately relevant in this time frame. So that's when I really started pushing my own research, pushing my own timeline. And then I worked on the book proposal in 2017, and I went and met with publishers it was on Valentine's Day of 2018. And then in May, I quit my job and started working on the book full time. So from May 2018 until I turned in the final book was December 2020. So,
Actually,
oh,
that
excuse me, December 2019. Yeah,
sure.
sorry.
And actually, going through that process of hearing about it, I'm a little bit curious. What sort of reception did you get from editors when you were pitching the book? Were they more interested in sort of the history and the civil rights angle, or the fact that it was like a football related book and like felt like it would have more mainstream appeal that way, or what sort of reception did the book pitch get?
I was pleasantly surprised by how well all the editors and publishers understood my vision for the book, which was that we're going to tell the story of this football team, but this wouldn't be a good book if it was just about a football team. Like I needed the history that led to the camps. I needed things before Pearl Harbor because, I'm a white American. I'm not Japanese American. So when I started working and researching this book, I realized that there's this sort of there's a misunderstanding in most of America that all of incarceration was due to Pearl Harbor. And what I tried to do with the book was show that there are decades and decades of racism and laws and xenophobia that led up to Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was just the final event that allowed what decades of racism hadn't been able to do so far, which was to create these camps. Because, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. There were just so many years of ranchers and farmers pushing back against Japanese Americans and the Issei generation that they were trying to get rid of Japanese and Japanese Americans since they first came to America. So this was just their opportunity to do that. And when I laid that out for editors and publishers, they saw my vision and no one pushed back. No one said you need to focus more on football. No one said you need to, find white characters, whatever it is. I was pleasantly surprised that when I was working towards finding a publisher and finding an editor, there was no one that pushed back on my vision for the book. One thing I did want to do when I was working and trying to find an editor and a publisher to work with was that as a white American, I thought that it was important for me to have an editor who is a person of color, because I know that personally there were I have blind spots just because of where I grew up, how I grew up, and my skin tone, that there were certain things that I was not, and there were just things that I was not presented with. I was not looked down upon for my own skin tone. So I wanted to work with someone who could catch me if I was saying things that were not necessarily insensitive, but things that could just be written in a better way. And I was really lucky to find my editor on the book was a man named Rakesh Satyal, his parents are from India and he grew up in Ohio. And I think he really helped me, even though he wasn't Japanese American. I think that there was a lot of overlap in his family experience that he helped impart in the work that I might not have otherwise been aware of or done on my own. So,
Yeah, no, I really appreciate hearing that that was part of your process as well, and I'm sure many folks in the audience feel similarly. So thank you for that. And I think at this point, I kind of want to transition into some of the actual content in your book, and in particular about the individuals that you were able to connect with in the course of researching the book and getting an understanding of the individuals whose stories go into it. So were there any particular folks that you felt like had really remarkable stories that you wanted to highlight in the book, or things that, when you heard their stories and learned directly from them what they experienced, you felt like they absolutely had to be
Sure.
part of what was presented?
Yeah, I think there's some people that I sort of met and families that I met and individuals. I spoke earlier about Kichi Ikeda, who is the one living player who I was able to interview for the book. And that's obviously a very special thing because that's somebody who was an integral part of this team. But then also I was able to speak with him and directly ask questions about his time in camp and what it was like being on this football team. Whereas it was wonderful to speak with Babe Nomura's family and Giorgio Oshinaga's family and Stanley Gawa's family and some of the other families that I was able to speak with. But at the same time, it's you're hearing that history from one person removed, from whether it's a daughter or a spouse or a sibling or even a friend in some cases. But speaking with Kichi, that was the history that I was trying to tell. I was telling his individual story. And meeting with him, I actually met and interviewed Kichi at Janum in LA, and just the thinking about what all of that meant, speaking with him at this place that is focused so much on this history that I was trying to tell was really important for me. And it was a little overwhelming sometimes thinking about the, making sure that I told his story right and making sure I told all of these players' stories right. Again, this comes back to not being a member of the Japanese American community and making sure that I nailed every detail so that these families and these people that had trusted me with their story or their family's stories didn't feel shortchanged or didn't feel cheated by the work that I did. So other folks, like, when I first started reading all of the Sentinel stories, Babe Nomura's name just kept coming up over and over and over and over again in all the athletic stories. It wasn't just football, it was basketball, baseball, everything. And Babe was the first person that, I, like we all do these days, just punch someone into Google and see. And when his history came up and I saw his history before the war as an athlete, during the war, after the war, when he played at San Jose State. And, he was so easily, he was the person that I knew that the story had to revolve around, because if I could, it's still in, even though I wanted to add all of this stuff, it still had to be a sports story. So I knew that Babe's prowess on the field and his athleticism, what was going to hook some readers onto the book. And, his story. And then once I started learning more about Giorgio Oshinaga and their friendship that grew from when they first met at Santa Anita, and then when that friendship grew at Heart Mountain, and then it continued on until their deaths, I saw an opportunity to say, okay, here's a way, Babe grew up in Hollywood. George grew up in a family of strawberry farmers, and that was sort of itinerant around the Southern Bay area. So they moved from piece of land to piece of land. I thought that was a really interesting way to sort of talk about the different parts of the Japanese American experience leading up to incarceration. Because I think if you come from outside the community, you sort of view any community as this monolith, whether it's Black Americans or Italian Americans or Japanese Americans. You view them through a sort of specific lens of how you think that community acts or what their day-to-day life is like. But Babe's teenage years was much different than George's teenage years before the camp. So I thought that was a way to sort of show a little bit of difference, that there were farming communities, but then also life for Japanese Americans in LA, in the city, or in San Francisco at that point was much different than a lot of the Japanese American farmers in some of the Central Valley areas. And then there were some other folks that I met through happenstance. The very first time I went to the Heart Mountain pilgrimage, I was sitting in the audience for the opening event, and I had just met someone who was going to give me to flip through their parents' Heart Mountain High School yearbook. So I was sitting in the audience, flipping through the yearbook. And, if any of you have been to these pilgrimages, there aren't that many white people sitting there by themselves. So people were sort of looking at me like, what's this guy's deal? And
Mhm.
someone sitting next to me said, excuse me, but what are you looking at? Why are you here?
Uh-huh.
And I sort of explained, I'm working on this project about the Heart Mountain High School football team. And they said, oh, my uncle played on the team. And then they pointed me out. They're like, my uncle was Stanigawa. Those are his kids. So then I was immediately able to meet this other family that I would not have possibly, maybe wouldn't have met because Stan didn't play as much. But Stan's story just gave me a complete different experience too, and in what his life was like in camp. And then, going through the different archives, whether it was at Janum or the Densho archives were especially helpful, and the Heart Mountain archives in Wyoming, going through all of these different oral histories. That's how I found Teizo Matsumoto, who was another player on the team who eventually became a draft resistor. And that was a way to tie those two stories together in a way that didn't seem unnatural by just jamming those two timelines together in the book. So, those are sort of the 5 players that I look at in the book that we follow at any depth. And it was, I thought that they all represented something a little bit different and a different way into the story that I really liked, having 5 characters and 5 different people that provided a depth that, 1 or 2 people wouldn't have.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think one thing that really stands out for folks that learn about the book and the Eagles in general, right, is just how successful they were on the field, right? And that's
Mhm.
really remarkable. They had an undefeated season. You described them as the greatest high school football team in the history of Wyoming
Yeah.
high school football, right? So in the course of, learning about the team and, their triumphs, on the field, like, did you get any sense of why they were so successful? Was it a matter of just them having better talent on field,
Right.
just better players, or did these players come from places that had well-developed and established and sophisticated football programs? Like, how do you explain how well they did?
Yeah, it was a combination of a couple of things, and some of it was like me trying to parse together that exact question. Was like, why were they so good? How
Mhm.
did this happen? And sort of reading between the lines and trying to figure out what they were doing in between all the newspaper stories that the Sentinel ran,
Mhm.
and just trying to find out enough about the history of these players and the people there. So the Heart Mountain High School, when it opened in 1942, there were no athletics. By that fall, they had a couple basketball games. That spring, they had a couple baseball games in the spring of 43. And then they decided to start this high school football team. And when they had tryouts the very first day, 40 kids showed up, and only 3 of them had ever played high school football before.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so they were basically trying to they put out a call to any high school athlete that had any ounce of talent. So what they tried to do was find fast guys. So they found shortstops and decathletes and point guards. And they tried to find any player that was quick. And then they basically put them on the field and said, okay, you 3 guys. So it was Babe, uh, Horse, and another player who grew up in Long Beach. Those are the 3 guys who had any high school football experience. And they said, all right, you guys got to sort of help us teach everyone else how to play football. And the other thing that really helped them is they had one coach who was a white guy from Wyoming, but their other coach, an assistant coach, was this guy named Tubby. And he had played at Los Angeles City College about 15 years earlier. So
Mhm.
he had experience as a college football player. He worked at LA Central Market before incarceration. And then when he got there, they needed somebody to sort of help with the athletic department. And they brought him on. And he had been introduced back in LA to this sort of prototype of a West Coast offense where they would play a really fast up tempo game and sort of try to spread the game out. Because I think that as a Japanese American, at that point, Japanese Americans, due to centuries of a specific diet, were much smaller than their opponents, especially in Wyoming.
Right.
So you had every game, the Eagles were outweighed by 30 or 40 pounds on average
Wow.
per man.
Yeah.
Um, so they basically had to find a way to use and utilize their technically their disadvantage to their advantage. So
Mhm.
they played a very fast game, and that they would take, they would take very few timeouts, and they would just try to outrun their opponents. They would run some trick plays, but a lot of times what they would do is, back in the 40s, football was very, very linear, very straightforward. That the running backs try to smash the ball through everyone. And when you're 125 pounds and your opponent is 170 pounds, that's not going to work most of the time.
Oh.
Yeah. So what they decided to do is they decided to start throwing the ball, which, again, 40s football is a lot of running. Quarterbacks sometimes would throw the ball 9 or 10 times a game.
Mhm.
And the Eagles tried to double or triple that every week. And it kept their opponents on their heels. And at this point in football history, players are playing both sides of the ball. So you're playing offense, and then you go right over and you play defense. So if you can tire out your opponent by being faster, by being in better shape, and by being smaller, then you can, once they get on defense, they're exhausted and they're sucking wind. It also meant that they're faster on defense, and they're smaller and they can get through the line. They blocked a lot of punt attempts.
Hmm.
The center for one of the linemen for the Eagles was a young man by the name of Yuichi Hosozawa. He played center for the team at 120 pounds. And then so on the other side of the ball, he would basically squeeze through all of these bigger linemen. He blocked, I think, 10 punts in 1 year. And it was just because he could get through and get to the ball right when it got on the punter's foot. So you basically had all of these ways that you could look at it and say, oh, we're not going to be able to compete against these guys because we're 135 pounds or we're 150 pounds. These guys are all bigger than us. Or we could flip that on its head and use everything that we have in our arsenal to try to win these games. And that's exactly what they did.
That's incredible. I really wish that I could watch video footage
Oh my
of how
gosh,
these
I
games
know.
went. Yeah. So I guess the
Um,
next best thing is reading your book, right?
yeah, well, and that was the thing that I found in that the Sentinel stories, the only way that I was able to recreate the chapters with the
Mhm.
games in it was that the Sentinel had just meticulous stories about basically play by plays. And when I combined that, and the high school newspaper sent a reporter to write about the football game too. So I had two separate newspapers that I was
Mhm.
able to compare and sort of add enough play by play in each game to sort of try and bring each of these games to life in a way that in most situations I would not have been able to do, because you said, there's no video footage. There's
Mhm.
some photos, but most of them aren't from the games. And the ones that are from the games are WRA photos from when the Heart Mountain high school team played a team of all-stars that were men in their 20s from camp. So you can sort of get a sense of that, but you're just still looking at still photos. You're not seeing how the ball is moving around the field. The photographs from the WRA and then from various archives in Washington State and Cal and Heart Mountain and some other sources, UCLA, those were really good at helping to add some context to how many fans were there and how cold it was and what the field looked like. Because at some of these games, you had 4,000 or 5,000 people from Heart Mountain lining the field, which would be a pretty decent crowd for, definitely a big crowd for a high school game, definitely a big crowd for some smaller colleges even. And then when you think about the fact that there were 10 or 12,000 people in the Heart Mountain camp at that point, you had a third or half of those people just watching a football game on a Saturday afternoon, is pretty incredible to me, and I think really speaks to what this football team meant to the camp. And I tried to speak with Kichi about that, because it was kind of a hard thing to ask or ascertain from siblings or from their children of some of the players that I spoke with. But when I spoke with Keach about it, I said, was there like a sense that what you were doing was beyond the football field? What you were doing was bigger than just beating this high school team that came into camp to play you.
Uh-huh.
And he looked at me, was kind of like, no, we were just playing football. And I tried to ask him in like two other ways to try
Uh-huh.
to work around that question. And every time I eventually realized that I was just trying to impart something on the interview that wasn't there. And Kichi didn't believe that they were doing anything beyond football.
Mhm.
And I think with hindsight, it's easy to look at something from my point of view and say, oh, I think that's what was happening. But it was very clear that
Mhm.
he was a high school athlete who was getting an opportunity to play high school football, and he wanted to go out and win the game because he was a high school athlete, not because at this point he was an incarcerated Japanese American teenager. It was because he was a teenager playing football, which I kind of found I found it frustrating from like a journalistic point of view and from like a narrative point of view. But from
Mhm.
a human standpoint, I was like, well, I've been a teenager and I understand that like
Mhm.
it's very rare that you're on a field thinking about something much bigger than what you're actually doing play by play. So
Sure, but what about like the folks that were watching on the sidelines, in the stands, right? What did seeing these guys, in a way representing them on the
yeah,
field, and finding great success, and especially in the face of everything else that was happening off the field for the community,
yeah.
did you get folks talking about what the
Mhm.
team who was winning meant to them at the time?
Yeah. And I think that really revealed itself in the columns of the Sentinel, and then some of the interviews I did with some folks like Raymond Uno and Norm Mineta, some other people that I spoke to for the book, even in interviews or just in conversation. And for those younger kids at camp, if you were 8 or 10 or 6 and you were out there, in the same way that a lot of us who were high school or college athletes, you look up to these kids when you're 8 or 10 years old, and you say like, oh, that's something I want to do. And I think that this team gave people at Heart Mountain something to look forward to, and it gave them something to be proud of, and it really gave them something uh, to really feel like they were being honored. And I think that when Heart Mountain first opened, one of the very first things they did was build a baseball field, and I think that speaks to not only the value that the folks in this camp saw in sports, but it also showed that they were really trying to look out for the younger people in camp and give them something to do and give them something and some sense of normalcy that might not have existed without sort of the impetus that the older folks in camp, the Issei, had done, and even the older Nisei, and saying, no, we need to make this baseball field. And then a few months later, they said, no, we need to build this football field. And we need to sort of put pressure on the camp staff and the camp administrators to allow us to do this. Because otherwise, these kids are going to have nothing to do. And athletics is always an outlet for kids in whatever community, whether they're incarcerated in 1944 or whether they're just a kid in a city in 2021. So I think that by the Issei and the older Nisei deciding and saying, no, we need athletics and we need to focus on athletics in this camp, I think that decision very early on in camp had really positive repercussions, not only for the Eagles, but for everyone in camp, because it gave people something to do, even if it was only however many games the Eagles played. There's scrimmages, there's practice, there's baseball leagues, there's football leagues, sports. And it wasn't just in Heart Mountain, obviously, and Gila River and lots of the other camps. Sports became this real place, a point of pride, not only for the incarcerees, but honestly, just something to do.
So I think one thing that you're touching a little bit upon also is the fact that for the players, while they weren't necessarily cognizant of the fact that maybe they represented something more than just the on the field action, to the folks watching them, um, but they still, to a large degree, yeah, also represented, this sense of normalcy that had been taken away from them. And I think one of the other things about football itself is that it presents an opportunity for folks to compete on an equal playing field, so to speak, right? And um, I don't know. I think one thing I'm curious about is if the players felt that, because I think people were very aware that one of the reasons why they were placed in the camp in the first place was because of discrimination
Right.
based on their background and their race and their ethnicity. Did you think that the athletes playing football in a way demonstrated just actually how American they are, right? Because nothing
Yeah.
can be as American as football, right? Like the Super Bowl is
Yeah.
considered, a de facto national holiday, right?
Yeah.
As far as yeah, like the cultural optics of
Right.
having a Japanese American football team, did that play into any of this?
Yeah, and I think you're right in that, and it was honestly, it was part of the first thing that sort of like, literally like caught my eye, like, oh, Japanese American football team. In doing all the research for this book, you realize pretty early on that, baseball wasn't necessarily seen as this American sport to Japanese athletes, the Japanese immigrants, the Issei, because they had been playing baseball in Japan as well.
Hmm.
So, there wasn't necessarily that learning curve, but football was something so completely foreign that in 1906, we have the first example of Japanese Issei immigrants playing Chinese immigrants in this football game in San Francisco. And I think I'm like, when I started working on this book, I was like, wow, a Japanese American football team in the 1940s. But then you look back and the history is another almost 40 years before that, that a newspaper writes about it. So who knows how many years before they're actually playing. But I think you hit the nail on the head in that there is this sort of Americanism around football that is different than any other sport that they would have been playing. And a lot of that does come down to sort of the physicality of it.
Hmm.
And that's why everyone underestimated the Eagles team too. So the first season that the Eagles played, they had a hard time scheduling games because I don't think anyone, they barely were allowed into the Wyoming State High School Athletic Association. They're sort of they're sort of almost like they weren't really viewed as full members.
Hmm.
But then, so a lot of teams, a lot of towns didn't want to send their kids into this camp to play the games. But then the second season, they had a hard time scheduling games because nobody wanted to lose to a team of Japanese Americans. So I think that there was a lot at play there from the white people in Wyoming and Montana, but then also just this sense that we're a team of Japanese Americans who are undersized. We're in a camp. We live in barracks. We have nothing. And I think they developed this real sense of pride that not only are we winning these games, but we're winning football games. We're not winning baseball games. We're not winning basketball games. We're winning football games. And I think you're right. There was this, I don't know if it's necessarily approving of their Americanness, but I do think that innately, I don't think any of them could have looked past the fact that it was a team just of Japanese Americans that were playing teams almost primarily just of white Americans. And not only were they winning, no one even scored against the Eagles until the very last game they played. So, you have the neighboring town of Cody. They had a game on the schedule. They come to scrimmage them before the season starts. The Eagles beat them 45-0 in the scrimmage, and then Cody cancels the game on the schedule because they don't want to lose to the team from the prison camp up the road. So you have all these dynamics at play where even though they're great, they still can't, for the most part, really even show how great they are because no one wants to play them.
Hmm. Interesting. And I know that proving your Americanness also kind of went hand in hand with the things that the players dealt with off the field too, right? Especially when they were faced with the decision on whether or not they would serve the U.S. military during the war in the face of being incarcerated by the same government, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's for me,
how,
that was when, once I realized and started learning more about the draft resistance movement at Heart Mountain, and you realize that the kids on the Eagles are the same people who are having to make this decision after the War Department reinstates the draft in 1944. After they reinstate the draft, these young men are sometimes going right from football practice, getting on a bus and going to their draft physicals, and they're coming back as privates to the next practice that they have after passing their draft physicals and coming back as Army privates to play the rest of their high school games. So once I saw that, and you start thinking about the decisions that you have to make, the one thing that I liked about this story is that there's a universality of the teenage experience. No matter where we've all grown up or the community that we grew up in, we've all had the experience of being a teenager, whether that was a good experience or a bad experience. There's so much overlap in how we all experience our teenage years that, I kept trying to put myself in these kids' shoes, whether it was on the football field, and especially when it came to having to decide whether to resist the draft, whether to go to your draft funeral or draft, physical, not draft funeral. And I think that there are so many layers when you're a Japanese American 18-year-old at Heart Mountain. There's so many different, quote, allegiances that you had to think about. You had to think about your allegiance to yourself, your family, your community as a Japanese American, and then also just as an American. And having to sort of think about all of those different loyalties and all the different sort of groups that are pulling you in different directions, and then being asked, the final decision is, are you willing to essentially risk your life and be sent to the front lines in France and Italy for this conviction of being American? And I think that everyone answered that question differently. Some of the players went to their physical, some resisted the draft, some went to the physical, and some of the best players on the Eagles were actually declared physically ineligible for the draft, even though they're the best football players. So I won't give away who that is if folks haven't read the book, but, and then you have men who resist the draft and then go to prison for that decision. And then you have also a lot of men from Heart Mountain who sign up and go and fight bravely in the 442 and are honored to this day, rightfully, for that bravery. And so I think that, like you said, these sort of Americanness of who these teenagers are, they're obviously, all of them were Americans, not only by birth, but by how they felt and who they were. They knew, none of the kids on this team were Issei. None of these kids on this team were even Kibe. So you have, just American, almost none of them had ever even left the United States. So, thinking about the fact that their loyalty was questioned, it makes me want to bang my head against the wall.
Yeah, and certainly that whole issue still remains divisive within our community to this day, right? So
yeah.
And so you touched upon the universality of the teenage experience, which is actually something that I hadn't considered, up to this point about your book. But one thing that did, immediately occur to me was the universality of sports and how that can be used as a vehicle for people to transcend social divides, right? And to really come to common understandings. And, this book in particular strikes me as an excellent example of how sports can do that. And could you maybe speak about how you feel like the book can be used as a vehicle, using sports as the sort of the pathway in for folks that aren't, part of the Japanese American community, that don't immediately relate to this history or experience, and what it can mean for, educating a broader public?
Yeah, that was, once I started really diving into this book was when I realized that, especially as a white American, I had an opportunity to gain a new audience for this history. It's unfortunate that there hasn't been as big of an audience for this in the past, and that our history books don't teach us as much. But, even I was trying to look forward and say, okay, how can I get as many people to sort of, I guess, how can I kind of trick as many people as possible into learning about this history of Japanese American incarceration and the decades that led up to it, with the development of Japanese American agriculture on the West Coast that led to sort of the racism and xenophobia of the early 20th century that eventually led to, spies in the Japanese American community, and all of these things that eventually led to incarceration after Pearl Harbor. And by sort of hooking people in on the story of football and World War II, you sort of I realized that I could help. That sounds sort of petty, but I realized that there was a way that I could help gain a new audience in not only white America, but Black America and other groups that just hadn't been introduced to this subject as much as they should have been. When I started working on this book, I looked back and I tried to find as many high school textbooks as I could and wanted to see in each one of these high school textbooks how much time is spent on the subject of Japanese American incarceration. And in most of them, it's one page. So you have 120,000 people incarcerated in the middle of World War II. And then for most books, it gets one page of history. So maybe that's a day, maybe depending on the school district you grew up in and where that is. If you grew up on the West Coast, you probably have a better understanding of this. Just culturally, there's more Japanese Americans still on the West Coast. I grew up in New York. And I can tell you, even in AP US history, I didn't learn as much about this as you would hope in an advanced placement course. So when I started working on this book, I really took it personally as an opportunity to try and right that wrong a little bit. So even if it's 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people or 100,000 people that end up reading this book that aren't as familiar with this time period in our history, I took it very seriously and tried to work every sentence to the point where I was teaching someone a story. And obviously people would pick this book up because they want to read a story about this football team. And I tried to keep the narrative going while still giving them enough new information that they said, oh, I had no idea that all this happened before the camps. So, I thought about that a lot leading up to when I was researching the book, when I was writing the book. I didn't sleep a lot of nights because, as someone from outside the Japanese American community, you don't want to screw it up, and there's a responsibility. If I was Japanese American, there's a different responsibility than if I'm a white American writing this story too. And one other thing that I wanted to add was that this book, there's lots of academic writing about Japanese American incarceration, and there's lots and lots of memoirs about Japanese American incarceration, but there's unfortunately not too many narrative books that tell the history through a certain amount of real people that you follow through the whole book. And I thought that that was an opportunity to reach sort of a narrative nonfiction audience that might not have been into it as well educated on this. Folks who are interested in books about all sorts of different aspects of history that maybe just hadn't picked up a book about Japanese American incarceration because there wasn't one sort of in that vein. And now, in this year, we have this book, we have Facing the Mountain, Daniel James Brown book. So, and I hope there's hundreds more, because anytime anyone has an opportunity to learn about Japanese American incarceration, whether it's through my book, Daniel's book, a YouTube channel, a TikTok presentation, whatever it is, I think that this is a part of our history that we don't learn enough and is unfortunately still relevant today. When I started writing the book and really started working on it in 2016, whenever I would talk to people, they would say, oh, that feels so relevant right now. Like that's such a relevant thing. And I would say, yeah, you're right. But then over the 4 years between then and when the book came out in January 2021, what they would compare it to would always change. Like what they would say was relevant would always change. So sometimes they would say, oh, that's so relevant right now because of the immigration ban on Muslim majority countries. And then they would say, oh, it's so relevant right now because of family separation. And then they would say, oh, it's so relevant now because of the kids in cages. And then it was so relevant because of anti-Asian violence during COVID. And then the day after my book comes out is the insurrection on the Capitol. And so much of that was based on the same thing that led to incarceration, which was a disinformation and misinformation campaign from politicians and media. So then even as soon as the book comes out, then it becomes a whole other thing that people can compare this time period to. which is, obviously pretty distressing that 80 years after the camps, that there's still a lot of things in American life that it can be compared to.
Well, I think it's absolutely important that you present information in a way that enables people to be able to connect those dots too, even when it's not necessarily about something that is the focus of your book, right? But something
Yeah.
that kind of gives them the tools to be able to think more critically in that way.
Right.
So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to actually be so diligent and feel this sense of responsibility to present the information in a way that is fair and correct, and in a way that honors the experience of our community. So thank you so much for
Oh,
doing it this way.
thank you. And I mean, I couldn't have done this book without the support and diligence of the Japanese American community. So whether it was individuals that I interviewed for the book, the Heart Mountain community, Janum, Densho, so many different organizations helped, scholars. And when I said earlier that there are a lot of academic texts and a lot of memoirs, I didn't want that to come off as dismissive of those two things, because I use those two things so much in building out this book. So I thought about that afterwards. I just want to make sure that I'm clear that I think that those are very, very valuable and important to how we learn about this. But, you know, again, I wouldn't have done this book if I hadn't had the sign off from the families that I wanted to work on, and the Heart Mountain community, especially because it wouldn't have been a very good book. It wouldn't have been a good book, and it would have been morally kind of gray, I think. And it would have sat really poorly with me if I hadn't reached out to all these families and tried to put in that level of work. Because again, this isn't my community, and I wanted to make sure that all these families felt honored and respected by the final product and the final book that I put out. So
Appreciate that. And with that, that kind of brings me to the end of my questions for you. But I know that some folks in the audience might be curious to, ask questions of their own for you as well. So at this point, we'll entertain some questions from the audience. If you have a question for Bradford, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll read it out loud for everyone to hear. And hopefully, Bradford can answer some of your questions here as well. Do we have any questions from the audience? Feel free to put them in the chat.
and if anyone has anything that they think about later on,
Mhm.
anyone is more than welcome to email me. My email is just bradford.pearson@gmail.com. You're more than welcome. And, it might take me a couple days to get back to you, but I always respond to folks, and I always appreciate hearing from people afterwards too.
That's great. And we'll certainly wait a couple more moments to see if any questions do come in. But at this point, while we wait for additional questions, do you have any current writing projects or other forthcoming books for us to
Oh,
look forward
man.
to?
Yeah. What are you, my agent? Yeah. Yeah. Right now I've been doing, after all my edits were done for the book, I was just lucky enough to get asked by the New York Times to work on a couple stories on a project that they did about sort of the end of World War II. And so they asked me if there was anything about the Japanese American community that either I didn't get in the book or thought was interesting. So I was able to write two stories for that package. One about the return back to the West Coast and how many Japanese Americans were unfortunately homeless and had to live in trailer parks, especially in Southern California. And then I was also able to write a story about Bunkado, the gift shop in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. So those are two other stories that I was sort of able to keep working and learn a little bit more about the Japanese American community. Right now, I've been doing some more stuff for the New York Times, and then also I'm a contributing editor here in Philadelphia to Philadelphia Magazine. So before I started working on the book, I was the features editor and interim editor in chief for Southwest's In-Flight magazine. So I come from magazines. So I've been working with Philadelphia Magazine, doing lots of different packages and writing and editing a lot of their features. So that's sort of what I've been doing right now. But I do need to start working on my next book. Which might, I won't give anything away, but it might be like, there might be one very small part about Japanese American life. And that was how I learned about this other subject, was there's like a little sliver of overlap that I was doing some research one day. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then it jumped me off into a whole different path. And hopefully soon, very soon, I should have some news about a possible adaptation of the Eagles of Heart Mountain for the screen. So
Oh, wow. Well, that
yeah,
would be exciting. Yeah, definitely let us know how that
I
turns
will.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're sort of in the very final stages of that, which is a process that has taken much longer than I thought it would.
Well, it certainly seems like a story that's fit for Hollywood. So
Yeah,
I
I
certainly
think so
hope that
too.
that materializes.
Yeah.
All right. So it looks like we do have one question from the audience, and this is from Emily. So she says, "Thank you for your work. In researching and writing this book, what surprised you, and or have you been changed by the work?"
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been changed by the work. I guess the things that surprised me, I always think about are I'm still just stunned that the federal government tried to draft the young men out of the camps. Like, it just seems so inhumane to have these young men in camp to begin with, but then to ask them to then go fight for a country that had incarcerated them. Um, that was just stunning to me. It was stunning to me to think about these young men possibly going off to war and then maybe on leave having to come back and be in a camp again, and that while their families were still in camp. So that was always just stunning to me. And I think some of the other stuff is some of the I really thought a lot about the people, whether they're young or old, who died in camp. And I think about them a lot because I think about how terrible that must have been to die in camp 1,000 miles away from your home, 1,000 miles away from, in some instances, what your home has been for the last 40 years or the last 20 years or whatever it is. Um, I think about that a lot, dying in an incarceration camp in the middle of winter in Wyoming, where it's -20. You spent your whole life in LA or San Francisco, and you came to the United States and created a great life for yourself. And this government removed all that and removed you. And then you died somewhere that was completely foreign to you. That always sticks with me, not to end on such a such a downer, but I think there's actually some more questions in the Q&A section too.
Yeah, so let's go over to the Q&A. So David has this question. He asks, Brad, have other descendants from Heart Mountain reached out to you after reading your book?
Oh yeah, that's been one of the more rewarding things about the book, is that you meet a certain amount of people. I think I went to the Heart Mountain pilgrimage 3 years. So you meet a lot of people like David Fujioka. You meet a lot of people there who are not necessarily, their families weren't on the football team, but their families were in camp, and you get to meet those people and you become friends with them. But then also, after the book came out, people start reaching out to you and saying, oh, my parents were at Heart Mountain, or I gave my dad, who was at Heart Mountain, I gave him your book for his birthday and he loved it. There was one person who emailed me who said they were at Heart Mountain and said it was the best book they'd ever read about life in camp. And I cried. Like, it's, you work on something and you hope that, um, not to be too sentimental, but you dedicate years of your life to a book that you hope will resonate with people. And to hear that coming from someone who lived this experience that I just wrote about was really, really emotional for me. And lots of people have reached out to me and said, oh, do you know anything about football or sports at Topaz or in Jerome or in any of the other camps? And, I reach out and I respond and say, oh, you might want to check out this resource, or, Densho has good oral history archives. And a lot of people have reached out and asked about my research and how I learned everything. So I try to give people archival tips. one thing is that the National Archives still has every single WRA file of anyone who was in camp, the physical files. They're not digitized, but if you go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., give them the file name that you want. If the person has passed away, or if you have permission from them to look at the file, then they just bring it out, which is kind of a very surreal thing, is to be able to flip through people's medical records. But just giving people, anyone that reaches out, I try to give them some of my time, because again, this book wouldn't have been possible if people hadn't given me their time too.
Sure. And have you been able to stay in touch with some of the families from the camp?
Oh yeah, pretty much all of them. All the families. I talk with Jan Mori, Babe Namora's daughter, weekly, usually. Sometimes it's more than that. Whenever I have events, I reach out to her, and then I've talked with Horse's family. I haven't talked to Kichi lately, but I know that our mutual friend Johnny Gogo, when he is working on his flag signing project, Kichi Ikeda actually came and signed the flag for him, and then signed the Eagles of Heart Mountain when Judge Gogo was there. And then Stanigawa's family, a lot of them are in California and Hawaii, so I reach out to them. After the book came out, they sent me some fantastic Hawaiian coffee. So yeah, it's really, and I talk with the people at Heart Mountain at the foundation a lot, depending on different events that I'm doing, and them. Sometimes people reach out to them to get my contact information. So this is something that with this project, I always wanted people to know that I wasn't just parachuting into this group to do this book, and then I was going to pull out, write the book, and then leave. And this book and the community that it's about have become really important to me too. So I can't really imagine. Like I didn't go to the Heart Mountain pilgrimage the last 2 years because of COVID, but if it's again and it's safe next year, I'll go, because I just love going, and it's a fantastic event that I really enjoy, and I've made lots of friends up there now. So.
And we have one comment from the audience as well. It says that they came across your book via audiobooks mid 2020, and they had never heard about the team before, but they also note that reading the book got them through COVID, the lockdown. So
That's so nice.
yeah, and we're not really out of the woods yet with this pandemic, so there's still time to read the book with the pandemic period. So,
and that gives me a quick opportunity to shout out Fyodor Chin, who is the audiobook narrator, who did just an awesome job. And I guess that sort of comes back to when I was looking for an editor that I thought would help me work on the story. I also did the same thing for my audiobook narrator, is that I wanted to have somebody who was familiar with the Japanese language and knew the intonations and wouldn't screw up how words were pronounced, whether it was Japanese last names or certain sayings or things. So I went through a lot of different narrators too, to find someone that I knew would tell this story in a way that, again, I thought really respected the community. So.
All right. Well, it looks like that brings us to the end of the questions from the audience. But with that being said, really, really enjoyed our time together here tonight. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing, your wonderful work on behalf of our community. And so for folks who aren't familiar yet, this is what the book looks like, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. So make sure you pick up your copy, and you see it on the shelf behind Bradford.
See if I can get my hand under the hardcover. There's the hardcover over there. The paperback came out. Hardcover's out. The Kindle book right now is on sale, I think, pretty much everywhere. So if you're an ebook reader, and like the other listener said, the audiobook is great. So
that's great. All right. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us tonight as well. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending out the recording and posting to the center's website and social media. So I can always revisit this conversation at a later date or share it with others so that they learn about this wonderful book and our history as well. So again, on behalf of the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, We want to thank everyone again for attending, and please have a good night. Take care. All right.
Thank you
Bye
all.
now.